Hello, and welcome back to History 122. In this segment, we're going to be looking at or getting a lecture on the state of the world, its various regions and populations, right at the time leading up to 1450, which will put us give us allow us basically to orient ourselves with regard to what was going on as we kick off this course. So we'll be in this next hour or so examining the experiences occurring at the origins of the modern world, the contests and developments surrounding the centralization, really, of authority and power. Specifically, we'll be looking at China, the rise of the Ming Dynasty, its expansionist agenda, also moving kind of westward across the Asian continent to the Islamic empires of the Ottomans and the Sassanids, and then continuing on into Europe and its experiences and kind of internal strife, you might say, with this 1-2 punch of the bubonic plague, as well as the Hundred Years' War that kind of coexisted and led to fundamental transformations within and across European kingdoms and societies. From there, we'll move across the Mediterranean into the African continent, examining briefly their kingdoms and establishing empires, and also the lucrative trade routes that were being set up to traverse the Saharan desert. Across the Atlantic, we'll wrap up things by looking briefly again at the Americas. This is largely and well handled in your readings of chapter 15 in your textbook for this week. But there are just a couple themes that I wanted to touch on before, like I said, wrapping things up with this kind of a overarching synopsis, really, of the world by the mid 15th century. So, looking at or starting with China and as well as Japan, it's important to understand that by the 14th century, the Mongols, which had come to dominate the Eurasian landmass, stretching from East Asia all the way across to what is today the Middle East primarily, and up as far north into the reaches of Ukraine, but also Russia as well, and the steppe lands there. The Mongols' expansive empire began to erode, and as a result, this allowed for more localized populations to regain their sense of autonomy and reestablish themselves. And this, one of the best examples of this, was the resurgence of the Ming Dynasty, the imperial order within China itself. China, under the Ming Dynasty, established in roughly about 1368, conquered Mongol territory that was contiguous to their established boundaries. You can see this with the documentary on Zheng He. It's actually Zheng He's family that was on the receiving end, you might say, of the expansionist invasion of the Ming Dynasty and Chinese power. The dynasty sought to exert, obviously, Chinese dominance throughout the Indian Ocean once it had managed to secure its holdings on the Chinese mainland. It established a hierarchy that it wished to convey basically to its neighbors, both regionally and globally as well. And this was grounded in the idea that the Chinese imperial order lay at the center of its sense of global orientation. This reflected Chinese philosophical foundations, and was really characteristic of all and nearly all civilizations, that there's a principle of legitimacy, often through divine means. You'll see this expressed in the study of the Ottomans and Omar's presentation that I've uploaded through the BBC Select production. But also at virtually any civilization that you study, you're going to see that kind of parallel from one civilization to another. Alongside this, Japan was also grappling with a series of internal conflicts. Contrary to China, Japanese society had managed to thwart Mongol invasion through acts of nature. In 1274 and 1281, you have the kamikaze, this divine wind in the form of hurricanes, sweep across the East China Sea and the Tsushima Strait to destroy on two separate occasions, Mongol fleets that had amassed and were preparing to invade the home islands of Japan. That kind of divine intervention in the eyes of the Japanese people allowed them to be spared from Mongol influence and occupation. However, the imperial order in Japan, separate in its identity from the imperial order in China, became subservient or subordinate to appointed warlords, the shogun, and the establishment of the shogunate within the Japanese socio-political order. So it was really these warlords, these provincial warlords, that held the actual power, political and military power, and were the ones that were driving and determining affairs of state within the Japanese mainland. These factions, the contests for power between shoguns, these provincial warlords, devolved into civil war that lasted nearly a century. So that by, I believe it's 1467, Japan was going to devolve into civil war that would last nearly a century. And it's as a result of that domestic instability and infighting that contributed really to its isolation. That there was no formal drive to expand either regionally or even globally within the Japanese hierarchy or powers that be at the time. Contests for power were so volatile within Chinese or Japanese society that just was not possible. Looking ahead, moving on to the Islamic empires, Ragay Omar, the host of that BBC Select documentary on the Ottomans, really gives an excellent overview of the Ottomans' origins and rise to power. Now, like the Chinese, the Ottomans and the Sassanids emerged from Mongol rule, as again Mongol influence began to retreat across the Eurasian continent. And as Omar aptly describes, this was the culminating event, the monumental event, the moment really when Mehmed II and the Ottoman Empire as a whole established themselves as a world power. The fall of Constantinople was a key turning point in several respects. You have in Omar's documentary the kind of well-balanced presentation of the competing points of view, right, between those that are kind of more pro-Ottoman leaning as far as how the Ottomans governed after the fall of Constantinople. That those that look favorably upon the Ottomans say that, well, they allowed for uh, freedom of expression of faith and freedom of religion to a limited degree, something that was not a guarantee at all by mid 15th century in the mid 15th century experience. Others on the other side saying, well, that there were still some very brutal, repressive kinds of practices held that the Ottomans upheld, which kind of undermine this idea of altruism and benevolence on the behalf of the Ottomans. That in that exchange, which is well articulated, I think, and gives you a sense of the different perspectives of historical study and approach. Really, at the heart of it, and I think one of the scholars comes to this conclusion, is that there's this interest in securing order and realizing that to make sure that there was some baseline of regimented order and a system in place that people would obey, that there needed to be an accommodation made on the behalf of the various cultures and religions over which the Ottomans governed. So I think it's that kind of approach that is really well done in that hour-long presentation. Another interesting side note is the fate of the Hagia Sophia, the massive sprawling kind of church within the confines of Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, and its transition from a Christian church to an Islamic mosque. What they don't really mention is that how relatively common really this was in particularly areas of the Eastern Mediterranean where you have an overlap of Christian and Islamic populations, where Christian churches would be simply retrofitted or refitted to become mosques. Hagia Sophia was not kind of an outlier in any way. It was actually more symbolic of a broader trend. What's also interesting about the study of these empires, in particular the Ottomans, which we give particular attention to, and its coexisting Sassafid Empire, is that these two rivals began to centered around the conflict, the broader conflict, more entrenched conflict between Sunni and Shia sects of Islam. So as the Mongols retreat, as these empires re-emerge or resurface, and these new powers come to the fore, they bring with them their orientations towards the Islamic faith. The Ottomans were followers of a Sunni Islam, that is to say that they had particular practices in following the faith, whereas Shia members believe in other practices of being devout to the original teachings of Islam. And these two communities, these two religious kind of sects or factions, were very could come into conflict rather easily at times in their long history. This bifurcation, this kind of duality between or within the Islamic faith itself, is one not very unique. I mean, you have the same effect, the same thing happening between Catholic Christians obeying the teachings of the Pope in Rome, and the Eastern Orthodox Christians turning toward the patriarch of the Christian church in Constantinople before its fall in 1453. And how, and I think Omar's documentary mentions this, where Constantinople is severely weakened by the sacking of that very city by Christian crusaders who were coming from the Italian peninsula on their way to crusading in the Holy Land, which they never did in the early 13th century. They simply looted Constantinople of its riches and then proceeded to make their way back to Italy. So, and those are two Christian communities, basically engaging in hostilities with one another. So another example would be, and we'll take a closer look at this next week, is the Protestant Reformation, in which this fracturing of faith into a wider variety and spectrum of sects, all considering themselves to be Christian, engage in rather horrific types of conflict and atrocities that we'll see are pretty well documented. In Europe, again, kind of turning our attention here, you have these two key developments taking place, and this is where we're going to focus most of our attention for this lecture. Two key events, one being the bubonic plague and the other being the 100 Years' War. These two kind of catastrophes that are going to affect the European continent, one universally and the other one between England and France, that are going to, these two main powers or main rivals at that period of time, that are going to set separate courses for each of them as we look ahead into the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries down the road. The bubonic plague dominated the latter half of the 14th and first half of the 15th centuries. Now, plagues were nothing new in the human experience or in the European experience. There was a plague that broke out in classical Greece. There was another plague that broke out in the streets of Constantinople in the 6th century AD. In both of these cases, there was a large amount of social unrest that quickly followed on the heels of these epidemics. What is different about the bubonic plague affecting the entire continent of Europe at this time in the 14th and 15th centuries is the sheer scope and scale of death and decay that occurred. It's estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died, which is unprecedented in the annals of much of human history. And this happened extremely quickly because the transmission rates of this disease and the time between first symptoms and resulting death was so short, which we'll get into in just a moment. Ironically, the arrival of this plague in Europe was also a sign of advancement. That this plague was not simply a European matter. It was the result actually of increased interaction with other societies, and the consequence, you might say, of growing commerce between and trade with distant populations, and kind of the daisy chaining that was beginning to take place between Europe, the Middle East, populations in the Indian Ocean, and China as well. The Black Death actually originated in Central Asia, and it spread both east and west, so that it affected populations in China early on, before it made its first arrival in Europe. It is thought to have come from bacteria-laden fleas that were transported on the literal backs of black rats that would transit ships making their way through the Indian Ocean on their way to and from and around the Eurasia continent. So it's the bacteria itself that is the plague, or is the manifestation of the plague. The fleas fed on the blood of rats, livestock, and human beings, and the disease, the bacteria, would be transmitted in this way. As far as symptoms are concerned, the disease in humans affects or infects the lymph nodes, which are concentrated mainly in the groin, armpits, and the neck of individuals. And it breaks down the capillaries, which causes bruising and swelling on victims. So this is basically where the capillaries are the extremely fragile, very delicate structures in the human blood system, circulation system, where the membranes are so thin that individual blood cells can make their way from the bloodstream into muscles and tissue in order to provide nutrients and oxygen and so on and so forth for us to remain alive. So when the blood vessels begin to break down, they begin to rupture because the bacteria begins to collect in those junctures, in those capillaries. The tissue ruptures, blood begins to flow with bleed internally, and therefore you have the internal bleeding taking place, which is what the bruising is demonstrating, or a direct effect of. Other symptoms would include vomiting, typically the vomiting of blood, high fever, coughing, as well as severe aches and pains. These latter symptoms are basically a result of the body beginning to decay and break down while the victim is still alive. And these are all natural symptoms, primarily ways for the human body, to alleviate itself of this foreign kind of contaminant and bacteria. Now, over time, because we're talking about bacteria, the plague mutated so that it could be transmitted by air. That is to say, it could live outside the human body for a limited period of time. So it went from being a bloodborne disease to that now being mutating into being an airborne disease, taking on aspects of kind of like similar to that of pneumonia. Now, it is this airborne variant that was lethal over 90% of the time. So not only is it more easily transmissible or transmittable, but also it's more lethal in its effect. The original strain, the bloodborne version, was lethal only about 30 to 35% of the time. Death was usually excruciating. It usually occurred within 4 to 7 days of a victim's first showing symptoms. And those that lived, and there were those that were able to live through an infection, they would often be racked with pain for the rest of their lives. They would have these, in some cases, hideous looking scars marking their traumas with this disease. That's a result of basically in some instances, in some records, they describe how the sick, the bedridden, would jump out of bed as their bodies began to, the skin began to rip from the inside out. When the skin could no longer hold back the pooling of blood, it would just simply rip open in these festering wounds. So it was pretty heinous as far as diseases are concerned. The disease, the plague, first appeared in Europe in 1348 in islands and in major port cities of the Mediterranean region. So places like southern France, the Italian peninsula were hard hit initially. Within the 6 months of first signs of infection among the general population, the disease had spread throughout the entirety of the Italian peninsula. And from there, it moved inland rather rapidly. There's a couple reasons for this. First and foremost, there were trade routes that had networked basically all of Europe together and its major commercial centers. So the movement of people was quite effective and efficient. Also, Europe at the time was overpopulated, so that people were moving, they were in close contact with one another, and once you develop a kind of airborne type of disease, transmission rates skyrocketed, and this plague quickly grew out of control. By 1351, so that's just 3 years or so after first cases emerged within the continent, bubonic plague had run throughout England, the German principalities in Central Europe, and also some Russian cities as well. Now, part of this is due to the fact that European social standards were, kind of subpar, maybe in some respects. There was a poor standard of hygiene. Transmission rates were aided by the fact that the poorest members, the poorest segments of European society, were often housed under the same roof as livestock. So especially in rural areas of Europe, when it was a bloodborne disease and these fleas were hopping from victim to victim, the transmission of the disease was aided by that kind of general practice. It may not seem so outlandish. Today people can be quite close to their pets. Some historians argue that the plague had more limited effects and access in the cultural practices in places like the Islamic culture, where the population usually bathed more frequently. For one example, it's more common to bathe hands, face, and feet before prayer, which was in the Islamic faith practiced 5 times a day. So in that context, the body and key appendages are being bathed much more regularly, and therefore kind of being cleansed more regularly. Also, referring back to Omar's presentation of the Ottoman Empire, there's a segment that talks about the baths that were being constructed throughout the empire. So it's a society, a culture that was more grounded in those types of hygiene habits, essentially. So therefore, because of that, historians would argue, and some do, that basically that helped to mitigate the spread of the disease in those populations. Also, exposure to disease often builds immunities. So these populations to outside of Europe, primarily that had been grappling with bubonic plague for some time, they had experienced it for years prior to its arrival in Europe, and so therefore, their immune systems were kind of more adjusted to it. As far as Europe is concerned, the lasting effects were that once exposed, plague would reemerge in Europe periodically for the next several centuries, at least once a generation. That's roughly every 20 or 30 years, up through the 18th century. But it's this first contact, this first episode in the mid 14th century that was the most lethal. It's estimated that between 20 and 25 million people died in Europe alone, with an estimated 100 to 100 plus million people dying worldwide. It should be also noted that bubonic plague is still with us. It's still a disease, bacteria that infects human beings. But there are obviously antibodies that we have and treatment that mitigates the effects, and people die from it much less frequently. Also, that we practice much higher standards of hygiene help in that regard as well. There are key effects, key results coming out of this experience, however, in four main areas: agriculture, labor, technology, and which includes and also social mobility, social and cultural kind of mobility. With regard to agriculture, there were fewer people to feed. With a drop in population in an overpopulated continent, this meant that the price of food declined, which had been going up prior to the onset of the bubonic plague. There wasn't enough food to go around for the population prior to this disease, also which might have compromised immune systems because they had a poor diet. So as a result, agriculture is going to actually kind of rebound. The pressure is going to be taken off the farming industry to support the population. And this allowed them to turn to growing a wider variety of crops. Things like grapes, barley, dairy products, providing dairy products. These were once again became more popular rather than concentrating on bulk kind of cereal grains and goods simply to feed the hungry, feed the people. Instead, now you can have a more diversified diet as farmers begin to broaden the cultivation of crops. As far as labor is concerned, the labor pool shrank, and as a result, with fewer workers, those that survived had a greater leverage, so they could demand higher wages. There was an abundance of work to go around. If one did not have feel that they were getting a wage, a proper wage, they could travel or work elsewhere and benefit from a higher negotiated wage. Also, disease does not discriminate. That is to say that all members on the social ladder were affected equally. This created new opportunities. It allowed for social advancement. Landlords were now at the mercy of those looking to buy or rent property. There was more property available and in a state of flux as a result of the the population decline. and we're talking about a rapid population decline. There was a change in the mentality of society and culture in Europe itself, that there was a focus on getting more out of life, if not the most out of life, by doing the most with what you could with the time you had. So there was an emphasis on acquiring more comfortable standards of living, a growth in focusing on materialism and acquiring material goods, kind of a live for today type of mentality. And this was in direct contrast to more traditional social norms that were focused on depriving your mortal self of luxury, and focusing on religious piety and basically living a moral life in order to attain salvation in the afterlife. That was largely abandoned or transitioned away from during the bubonic plague and its aftermath. Work, labor begins to define meaning in people's lives, and existence, rather than religious devotion. So, what do you bring to the table as far as your ability to contribute to the common survival, the greater good, essentially? Knowledge and technology also experienced transformative change during this period of time as well. In the areas of knowledge, there was an emphasis on more accurate timekeeping, perhaps out of a fundamental need to make the most of time that you had. Medicine was also benefited from new practices. Things like experimentation and pharmacology became more formalized and regimented. There was an interest in public safety and public health during this period of time to systematically trace the transmission of disease, and try to mitigate and address those causes, in order to mitigate the disease and its spread. Also, in the field of education, there was transformative change. It became less formalized. Prior to the plague, if one wanted to become a scholar, they often had to enter and become a member of the clergy, the church, because it was the church that really held the keys to unlocking knowledge. Most of the texts that had been preserved were texts written in Latin, a language that was not spoken by the masses. In fact, it's what's called a dead language. It's really preserved most extensively in written text in a written format. It's only the Catholic Church today that conducts any type of business or religious ceremonies in Latin. Outside of that, it really serves no function directly in wider society. Yet, nonetheless, if you wanted to become a scholar, if you wanted to become enlightened in these areas of speciality, then you had to learn this other language even before you could start to pursue a scholarly life. That all changes with the onset of the bubonic plague. There's no time to devote years of time and attention to learning Latin. So what happens is that people begin to study in their own vernacular languages like Italian, French, English, German, and works. Texts begin to be translated into these vernacular languages, so knowledge becomes more accessible to a broader segment of society. Now, you still had to be literate, which was by no means universal, but at the very least it became more accessible because people that were literate in their own vernacular language now had greater access to knowledge. And this is a key development. This access to knowledge is a key development to the onset of the Renaissance, which is something we'll address next week. There's also a more general embrace of technology and technological development to replace the skilled labor and craftsmen and craftspeople that were lost in these epidemics in the bubonic plague. It was imperative that technology be employed to make up to fill that gap. So, in a hypothetical, you could have a master craftsman become ill with 20 years, say, of professional working knowledge of his or her industry, fall ill with bubonic plague and be dead within a week. And that's 20 years of knowledge and experience that has been wiped out. People entering into professional trades really did not care to apprentice for X number of years in order to become a master at a certain industry, a certain craft. There wasn't time for that. And so the focus on technological innovation, technological development, became more of a characteristic of the modern age. Things like the crossbow, eyeglasses, firearms, gunpowder really began to be put into regular use or more regular use during this period of time. They became more heavily relied upon. Technology, even today, you might say, reduces the time it took to train people to do a certain task. It led to greater efficiency, which is, as you might expect, or as you might conclude, is symptomatic of modernity itself. Military technology was put into almost immediate use, largely as a result of the concurrent event that was affecting much of Europe during this period of time, or at least heavily affecting England and France during this period of time, what's known as the 100 Years' War. The war itself is largely bundled into three separate phases. The first two phases went in England's favor, and the third phase was decisive in France's favor. Essentially, the background very quickly to this conflict was where the royal households, the kings and their family trees between in England and also in France were very closely intertwined. This is largely as a result of William the Conqueror's successful invasion of England from Normandy in 1066. By the 100 Years' War, by the 14th century, there is a vacancy. The reigning king of France has died. There's no apparent or direct heir, and it's at this time that the reigning king in England sees an opportunity to seize the crown of France, and therefore become not only the king of England but also simultaneously the king of France. That he, in his estimation, had a legitimate claim to the throne in France. And so this ignites the conflict between these two powers in Europe. It's also early on, throughout the course of this war that was raged periodically with periodic intensity over the course of 100 years. They used gunpowder, cannon at various battles over the course of the 100 years. Oftentimes when the plague was running rampant in either England or France or both, hostilities would abate, they would kind of cool until the immediate emergency passed, when the bubonic plague was not running roughshod through the populations. Then these two would go back at it as far as conflicting with one another. So it's not to say that the Hundred Years' War was a constant state of war for a century, but that these phases, when they're seen as all part of a larger whole known as the Hundred Years' War. In the second phase, the culminating event occurred on October 25th, 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt. This is where English forces, some 6,000 men, most of which were lightly armed archers, and were footsore, battle weary. They had been marching for some 250 miles towards the city of Calais, a port city on the northern shore of what is today France, along the English Channel. The idea was that they would get to that port facility, they would be resupplied, reprovisioned, and be safe from any type of immediate destruction. French forces understood the predicament that the English forces were in, and they realized that they had this opportunity to decide this war once and for all if they could cut off these English forces from getting to Calais and resupplying. So French forces, numbering some 20 to 30,000 men, most of which were knights and heavy cavalry, stood between the King of England, Henry V's army, and their safe haven of Calais along the northern coast. Against overwhelming odds, the French forces end up being routed in a colossal defeat known as the Battle of Agincourt, occurring in late October of 1415. This was largely the result of English longbowmen being able to effectively mow down the French forces that were charging across this muddy morass of a field as they tried to engage the English forces. The morale of both armies may have also played a significant role here in this unlikely outcome of an English victory. The English, for their side, basically fought for their very survival here. They knew that if they lost this battle, that their lives would largely be forfeit. It also helped that they had their king, King Henry V, on the field of battle with them, so that they were not only fighting for their own survival, they were directly fighting for their sovereign, which has a particularly high motivating effect in that day and age. French nobles, on the other hand, were more interested in divvying up the spoils of war. It's recorded that on the eve of battle, these rival French nobles were sitting around talking about what loot they would lay claim to once the English had been defeated. So that there was bickering even before the battle began. There was poor coordination of attacks on the part of the French. There were personal rivalries that helped to undermine any type of broader cohesion among the French forces. Also, these are French nobles fighting. The French king was not on the field, and so power was decentralized into the hands of these nobles. So there was no unifying chain of command, essentially, that helped to organize the French forces. Also, there's a kind of a social hierarchical aspect at play here in this particular battle, one where you have these English longbowmen who are employed for pennies a day for their service, often coming from the ranks of the common class, fighting and utterly destroying the noble aristocracy of the French kingdom. So that has a particularly kind of socially significant aspect to this one day battle. Fortunes changed. The fortunes of war changed in the third stage, of the last stage of the Hundred Years' War. Uh, Henry V, who had enjoyed victory at Agincourt, now not only by 1429 had not only to face the French forces, but France was also allied with and supported by a new Scottish army that had landed in France. The Scots, in what is today the northern portion of the United Kingdom, were no friends to the English, had been subject to English brutality under the English sovereign, and so therefore the Scots decided to support the French forces against Henry V. The English also had trouble keeping peace in the portions of the French countryside that they controlled, again because there was such a close intermarriage and association between English nobility, that meant that and the French crown. This meant that English nobles often had extensive land holdings in France along the European mainland. The local French under English rule in those areas rose up in rebellion, and so now the English nobles that were having to oversee and protect those areas now had to protect against their these contests for power within the borders of their own estates. In 1422, to compound matters and issues for the English crown, Henry V dies. His son is nothing but an infant and unable to rule in his own right, and so there's a regent that would be put in place on the throne and would decide matters of state until such time that the actual sovereign, who would become Henry VI, would be able to take over the reins of power officially. So there was, again, kind of a king pro tem, just kind of a temporary king for this period of time for the English. At almost the exact same time, in 1422, King Charles VII of France proclaims himself king of his people, of France itself. Now, he proclaimed himself king, but the coronation to actually become the official process by which an individual becomes king could not be held until 1429. So in this 7-year interim, King Charles VII is what's known as the Dauphin. He is the king in name only, essentially, until this ceremony can be held to make it official. The reason why it couldn't be officially coronated is because the traditional location for that event was in possession of the English. In 1429, the French liberate the town of, probably going to mispronounce this, Rheims, to have the ceremony of the coronation take place. The liberation of that town is largely a result of the efforts of Joan of Arc, a 16-year-old peasant girl coming from the French peasant class, who proclaimed that she had had numerous visions, divine in origin, that showed her leading the French people to victory against the English. This proclamation, this revelation, helped to revive the fighting spirit through the ranks of the French military. Joan of Arc was quite effective in her rallying and commanding of troops. In 1429, she was wounded on the field of battle at the Battle of Orleans. She was successful in defeating the English on several occasions. The siege of several cities, English-held cities, and the liberation of those cities in the eyes of the French meant that her stature among the population, the French population, grew enormously. In 1430, however, Joan of Arc is captured. She was captured by what are known as French aristocracy, the Burgundians. They were essentially members of landed French nobility, essentially, and they were allied with the English at the time. They captured Joan of Arc, turned her over to the English, who promptly tried her for heresy and for her crimes of witchcraft, where she was accused of seeing visions of various saints and receiving all these prophecies. She was burned at the stake. So one person's holy warrior becomes another people's heretic. By 1437, the Burgundians, the same Burgundians that had 7 years earlier betrayed Joan of Arc, switched their allegiance from the English to the French king, who was now actually king, King Charles VII. This happened as the fortunes of war began to turn in favor of the French sovereign as well. And over the next 2 decades, English influence on the mainland of Europe began to decline. The French were able to consolidate their holdings, and this allowed Charles to recapture all English possessions on the continent. And what's significant about the 100 Years' War here is that it promoted the growth of nationalism in both England and France. The war contributed to notions of identity. Under church rule, people identified themselves primarily as Christians, and that was the case for much of English history, or much of European history, following the fall of the Roman Empire. The problem with the 100 Years' War, however, is that the two combatants, the English and the French, are both Christian people. So other characteristics were needed to distinguish one from the other. And that's where the notions of nationalism come in, that people began to identify more directly with their liege, their sovereign, their king, and their Englishness or their Frenchness, rather than their religion. Military technology also proved extremely important. The feeding of and fielding of an army became prohibitively expensive, and so in order to keep costs down, military strategists began to focus on employing cheaper manpower, that is to say the common class, in the ranks to form the ranks, the actual physical ranks of an army. This is seen most clearly in the case of the Battle of Agincourt, where King Henry V of England is surrounded virtually by a majority of commoners that are helping to protect him save him from being captured. Commoners were easier to train, and they fought and worked for lower pay. Again, they were earning pennies a day, as opposed to having to reward nobles with lavish expanses of land or other property or large amounts of wealth. And so, in return for that, there's a certain degree of social empowerment that's beginning to take place, where commoners are gaining greater leverage. And I won't say parity really this early on, but at the very least, the trend is beginning to swing in that direction, particularly in England. France is going to take almost the direct opposite approach. But for English veterans of this war, they had paid a price. They had made sacrifices. They had earned valor on the field of battle in places like Agincourt, and so therefore there was a the avenues of influence and leverage and power were opened and available, made more easily available to the English greater ranks of English society.